So when the Soviet Union fell apart back in 1991, this really fascinating possibility opened up. You had all these newly independent Turkic republics in Central Asia, and they shared these deep, deep cultural and historical roots with Turkey. And the big question became, could that shared heritage, that feeling of being brotherly nations, actually be turned into a new economic powerhouse? Well, we're going to find out, because we're diving into an academic paper that crunched over 2 decades of data to see what really happened.
I mean, this was the big dream of the early 90s, right? The idea that these nations could link up and forge a powerful, integrated economic bloc. But, turning cultural kinship into something like a free trade zone, that's a massive undertaking. So, what does the evidence actually tell us? Did the dream match the reality?
Okay, first things first, let's be super clear on who we're talking about here. For this analysis, when we say the Turkic world, it's specifically referring to the economic ties between Turkey and 6 key partners: Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or the TRNC.
All right, so instead of building up all the suspense, let's just cut right to the chase. What's the bottom line? This analysis covers more than 2 decades of trade data, starting right at the beginning in 1992 and going all the way up to 2014. So, did this economic dream actually start to take shape?
Well, the growth was definitely there, you can't deny it. Back in 1992, right after these republics became independent, Turkey's exports to this group made up just a little over 2% of its global total. But fast forward to 2014, and that share had more than doubled. That is a pretty significant jump. By 2014, it hit its peak for this period at 5.27%. Now just think about that for a second. It means that roughly 1 out of every $20 that Turkey earned from its exports was coming from these 6 partners. That's a really meaningful economic connection. But the big question is still hanging there. Is it strong enough to build a real economic union?
And this brings us right to the paper's main conclusion. The author's verdict is pretty blunt. While that growth was definitely notable, these trade rates, they just weren't high enough. They weren't sufficient to really create a genuine free trade zone. So the dream was kind of bumping up against a hard statistical reality.
But you know how it is with averages, right? That 5.27% figure can hide the most interesting parts of the story. When you start to peel back the layers and look at the individual countries, you find that a couple of key partners were really pulling most of the weight.
Let's take Azerbaijan, for instance. In 1992, it was a pretty small partner, not even accounting for 1% of Turkey's total exports. But look at 2013. That number nearly tripled, turning Azerbaijan into a major pillar of this whole trade network.
And if you think that's something, the story with Turkmenistan is even more dramatic. In 1992, its share of Turkish exports was, it was almost nothing, a tiny fraction. By 2014, though, it had just exploded to over 1.4%. That made Turkmenistan another key engine driving all this growth.
So what was Turkey actually selling? This wasn't just abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. When you look at the trade with partners like Uzbekistan and the TRNC, you see the real-world stuff, the actual building blocks of a modernizing economy. We're talking about things like medicine, baby diapers and sanitary goods, iron and steel bars for construction, plastic pipes, even trailers and semi-trailers.
But here's the thing. So far, we've only been looking at one side of the street, right? We've only talked about what Turkey was selling. True economic integration, a real partnership, has to be a two-way street. So to get the whole story, we have to ask the other question. What was Turkey buying in return? And this is where the picture gets crystal clear, and it reveals a major imbalance. So while Turkey's exports to the Turkic world were surging past 5%, its imports from them barely crawled past 1%. It just wasn't a balanced partnership. It was more of a one-way economic street, with Turkey selling way, way more than it was buying.
So that trade imbalance, that's pretty much the final piece of the puzzle. It's really the key to understanding the paper's final verdict on how things stood with economic integration back in 2014.
The logic here is actually pretty simple, but it's powerful. So, step 1, trade, especially Turkish exports, grew a lot. No one's arguing with that. Step 2, but, and this is a big but, the relationship was super imbalanced, with goods mostly flowing in one direction. And that leads you straight to the conclusion. A real economic union needs balanced two-way trade.
By that standard, as of 2014, the dream just hadn't become a reality yet.
Of course, all this data we've been looking at stops in 2014, and a full decade has gone by since then. That's a decade filled with new geopolitical shifts, huge infrastructure projects, and changing political agreements, which leaves us with a really big question for today. In the years since, has this relationship finally started to find its balance? Has the dream of an integrated Turkic economic world finally started to come true?